and welcome to our webinar on Working Smart. I'm Jo Blackman, the Assistant Head for Teaching and Learning.
And I'm Peter Forrest-Biggs, I'm the Deputy Head Academic.
Thank you for submitting your questions on this topic. We've listened to those questions and we're going to present to you some strategies on how to support your children through working smart at secondary school. The resources that we've used are listed on this slide, so please feel free to check those out in your own time.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Jo. Thank you for inviting me to this webinar. I do think working smart's a really important thing, and I think it's at the heart of a successful time at school. Obviously, you and I work on the teaching and learning side of school, the academic side of that. But education, isn't it? I think you'd agree, is so much more than just what happens in the classroom. There's so many opportunities out there to educate the whole person. I think as a school, that's something that we're very proud of at Sir William Perkins's school. And what happens on the academic side is linked to the pastoral side, that sort of golden thread that runs through school, and also the co-curriculum. The co-curriculum is key to well-being, to a balance in life. And I'm really excited to talk about this today and to pass on some tips and tricks to those who have tuned in.
Great, so let's get started with the first question.
Okay, so related to that point, the first question, thank you to those who've contributed. How do I ensure my child has enough time to study and enjoy co-curricular activities, extracurricular activities? Well, the first thing I'd say on that is that you can't do it all. Just as with the academic curriculum, you start with a broad base of subjects and sort of rationalize those down to 3 at A level in the end. So too with your extracurricular activities. It is impossible to do, ballet and hockey and netball and trampolining and all these things to any decent standard all the way through school. You have to rationalize them, but I think it's imperative not to rationalize them down to 0. One of the saddest things that comes up when we do have these interventions, these meetings with parents of children who are underperforming, is when they say, right, well, the academics are going down a little bit here. We're going to have to can swimming. Swimming's got to go. And sometimes that comes from the pupil. I think that's really a missed opportunity, and that's why working smart and getting these habits of learning is really, really important. So what sort of top tips would I have? Well, the first one is just to do some of the things that we do as adults, perhaps instinctively, making lists, prioritizing them. There's that famous book, Eat the Frog. Have you heard that expression, to eat the frog, to do the thing that's difficult, first, in order. Even though it might be a little bit challenging, eat the frog is a good phrase to sort of embed with your pupils. When you're working with your children, do have a little conversation with them. Keep that dialogue going. But as we know with teenagers, they might not be receptive to being told what to do all of the time. So perhaps a question could be, how are you getting on with your work? Are you just copying out notes? Are you focusing entirely on content? Or are you practicing skills? Because both of those things are essential. I think that coaching mentality is really important. When people are busy, the question's all about how to balance study and extracurricular. We all have the same 24 hours. We have to sort of box clever to make sure that we achieve that work-life balance, but also don't neglect the academics. So say to them, look, I will facilitate everything that I can do for you, but I want you to come up with a plan, for you to own it, for you to map out how you're going to both study and perform on an extracurricular level. When pupils are working, when pupils are studying, one thing I've found quite effective is to draw up a timetable, to have a plan. And if you've got a good plan, schedule in and diarise within that plan some rewards, some pleasurable things like going to the shops with friends, or even if it is that sort of play rehearsal that you've committed to. Working with others is also a really powerful thing to do. I've had pupils in the past who've met in a local library do a couple of hours of work, plan what they're going to do, turn up with a purpose, and then the reward for that is some sort of social thing thereafter. Working with busy people with similar goals and aims can often be really helpful. And I think, it's an important thing to say, just to reiterate, that it's so important for me that you both have that extracurricular and the academics, because you do have to make sacrifices for both. but it is worth it, and actually you're the better for it. You don't want your child, I don't believe, to become one-dimensional and only be left with work in their life. So a few tips and tricks there, and I think Jo, you're now going to show us some vox pops, some healthy tips from young people here at Sir William Perkins School about how they work smart.
Yes, so let's hear what our students have to say.
Hi, I'm Sophie and I'm in Year 9, and to stay organised at SWPS, I make sure to make a timetable of homework for the week to stay on top of it. I write a list of what I need to bring in for the next day, e.g. safety goggles or lab coats, and I regularly check Teams and Firefly for upcoming homeworks.
Hi, my name's Dia and I'm in Year 9. Here are my tips to be organised. You should have the correct equipment for classes and try to complete homework on the day it's due, otherwise things will pile on top of.
Okay, great. Next question.
Okay, thank you, Jo. So the next question is, how can we instill a sense of independence and accountability whilst ensuring communication with parents? That's a great question, thank you. And I think for this, it all comes down to this idea for me of intrinsic motivation. If I think back in my career to those pupils who I think are probably the most successful, those who've gone on to Oxbridge or the medics or the dentists or those higher level applicants, those pupils who've not perhaps done those sort of things, but just smashed through their potential and really exceeded what expectations there were, they had one thing in common. They had a goal and they drove the agenda themselves to make it happen. And I suppose the question for us, which comes from this question here, is how do we instill that in our own children? I think it's a natural instinct of a parent to want to check in and keep your child on track, but this can run counter to this idea of independence and accountability as comes through in the question. And ironically, too much help can be a hindrance. And we as teachers are often talking about spoon feeding and trying to avoid sort of spoon feeding the children knowledge. And of course, if you can spoon feed children motivation as well, it can leave them ill prepared for life beyond school. That said, they are teenagers, their time is short. And if you certainly think about this sort of year 10, 11, year 12, 13 periods, those sort of GCSE and A-level periods, well, the first exam at Sir William Perkins School, at least, for GCSE is on the 9th of May. And the first exam, A-level exam, is on the 10th of May. So in essence, those 2 years, the year 11 and the year 13, the 5th year and the upper 6th in old money, are two-term affairs. And so, you know, time is short and you've got to box clever. And in a way, it would be sort of negligent just to sort of leave them to it. So what would my tips be on this? Well, I think keeping the channels of communication open is key, both with the learners and with the school, to ensure that there is a good degree of accountability. Work with the data that you have available, assimilate the data from reports, and then when you do sort of want to talk and check in with your child, you know, you can be a little bit more specific, as opposed to the sort of perennial, you know, get on with your work, do some work, do some work. You could instead be saying, you know, how are you getting on with those calculations in chemistry? Now, I know that they're an area that you've been finding difficult. So if you can be specific like that, it just appears a little bit less overwhelming and daunting from the child as well. Praise successes and progress made against these specific goals rather than, oh, you know, you've done lots of work. I think it's really, really vital, of course, to make sure that you keep your child motivated. That's a part that a parent can play. Make them their favourite meal, make them a cup of tea or whatever it may be. And also be there when they teach you something. I think that's a really powerful way. If they can teach you, you know, I'm going to tell you all about women in the Odyssey. I'm going to tell you all about the causes of the First World War. Whatever it is, you don't have to be expert on that. All you have to be is expert in asking the right questions. So you could say, oh, can you explain that a bit more? Can you give me a bit more detail there? Can you give me another side to that argument? And that all just helps your child draw out their knowledge and prepares them for the exam. I also think it's really important to have some sort of goal, you know, a sense of independence and accountability. If a child has something to go for, as I said with those pupils I've mentioned from the past, it can really help. You know, a very powerful question in life is, you know, what do you want? Why do you want it? Okay, I hear what you're saying. Well, what are you going to do straight away to achieve that goal? What are you going to do in a term's time? What are you going to do next year? And getting children to write those goals down, those specific goals, can be quite a smart way of working. So I hope that answers that question.
Yes, thank you, Peter. Right, what we got next?
On to the next.
Okay.
So the next one is how to support my dyslexic child with organising themselves for school and minimising effort for maximum outcomes on their learning. Another great question. So I have to say, the answer to this question, I'm afraid the short answer is that there are no shortcuts with dyslexic learners. It will take longer with dyslexic learners, but nevertheless, you have to work smartly with them. And I'm indebted in this conversation to my colleague Alexa Clark, who's the SENCO here. And I would say that the SENCO is a key resource for you as parents and for the learners as well, alongside the educational psychologist report that would have come through with that dyslexia diagnosis. So do use them as resources. But yeah, definitely much of what I'm going to say has come from Alexa today. A key thing with dyslexic children that works very effectively is something called overlearning, essentially repetition, going over it again and again, multiple times. That adage that slow and steady wins the race is very much true. And whilst you know, some children are able to cram and work intensively and retain things as they go, an important thing to note is that with dyslexic children, they'll come home, they'll be exhausted at the end of a day of school. It can be quite a challenge, and so that slow and steady approach is very effective. That will mean working in the holidays and working in a gradual way, but it will bear fruit in the long term. One thing I would say is just to have this idea that doing less is the solution, I don't think is a helpful strategy. You know, it's like anything. Something like French A level is a hard A level to do. There's only one solution. You just have to work harder. And I think doing it over a gradual process is really, really important. Technology can be a great asset when it comes to reducing cognitive load. And I know Joe's going to talk about tech and its virtues for all learners, really, later in this webinar. And this is particularly the case if your child can learn how to touch type. Because obviously if they can type sort of without thinking, then that's one fewer thing for them to consider. Alexa's mentioned a bit of software called English Type Senior, which is available on Amazon. I checked, and it's definitely worth a look at that to get that touch typing skill grounded early on. Handwriting, though, nevertheless, traditional means in handwriting is something that is also very important. There's an article written recently which talks about how handwriting can unlock creativity and thereby improve retention. You can be quite creative. The sort of lines and the diagrams and the shorthand that you can use can help retain stuff. And of course, on the tech side, you've got these Apple Pencils and iPads and things like that that can combine the two potentially. Asking the right questions, as I've mentioned before, is really, really key. Thinking to yourself, what is the purpose of this task? Am I just learning content? Am I just writing out notes? Or am I practicing a skill that's going to help me in the final analysis? Know how you work. Know how you learn best. Ultimately, know yourself and keep it varied. A suggestion from Alexa was to have 3 strategies to revise the same thing. Maybe that's flashcards, maybe that's teaching a parent, as I mentioned before, maybe that's setting yourself questions and doing it as an assessment for yourself. Just like we have the overlearning, we also have the value of pre-reading, of reading up on a topic before the lesson. Advanced preparation can be really great because, as I said, it can be very challenging for dyslexic learners in the classroom. A technique that I personally use as well is something called the Pomodoro technique. So Pomodoro are these little tomatoes, which are actually timers, sort of kitchen timers. And it's a 20-minute timer. It works on sort of levels of concentration. You say to yourself, well, I've got to prepare for this webinar. How long is it going to take me? I reckon it's going to take me 4 Pomodoros, 4 lots of 20 minutes. So I'd set the timer and I do 20 minutes, have a little break of a similar amount of time, and again and again and again. You can look that one up. It's called the Pomodoro technique, and I think it works for me, and I know it works for a lot of our learners. Now, there's a lot of research out there that says one of the most powerful things you can do for a child is to give them a workspace at home, a clear, uncluttered workspace, a desk in their room or wherever else in your house. But I would also say that there's value in mixing it up. just carrying on, ploughing away at the desk isn't necessarily going to be totally effective. There are sometimes you could move to the kitchen table, or maybe just sit outside in a garden under a tree, something like that, just to mix it up and to refresh yourself. You'll come back more effective, especially when it comes to revising for exams. There's all sorts of techniques for reading, scanning, reading for meaning, these sort of things that are available that work really, really well with dyslexic learners. And I'm not going to go into them now because time is not going to allow for that. There's a book here that Alexa's recommended. It's called Study Skills for Students with Dyslexia by Sandra Hargreaves and Jamie Crabb. And this is a really great book. It's very well laid out, and I would wholeheartedly recommend that to you. Sometimes another thing that we talked about is that, you know, sometimes it's about knowing what is good enough and not trying to be a perfectionist. Sometimes getting it done, getting the job done is perfection in itself. I go further than that and say that perfectionism in many ways is a flaw, and it's something we really need to work through with children. One way you can do that in terms of revision and writing essays and so on is just to write. You know, sometimes you're thinking, I've got to write this 1,000 words on something like that. You redraft the first line 20 times. Sometimes just go for it. And especially with dyslexic learners, it might be sort of hamstrung by concerns about spelling and fluidity of writing. Just write, just go for it. And building that is one way of combating perfectionism. I think that's all I have to say on that.
Thank you very much. Okay, what's next? Okay, so this is one of my questions now. So would love to hear any sensible ways of working smart, and how can I use technology to help support my children working smart? Great. So I think how I wanted to start this one off is I wanted to dispel a couple of myths. So many students perceive highlighting as a really effective way to revise, and rereading those notes that they've highlighted meticulously over and over again. And often what we find is when we are presented with these notes as teachers, it's just a sea of different coloured neon, and we can't really distinguish what the key parts of those notes are because of that. In a recent study published in an educational psychology review, it suggests that firstly, we should not see these pages with highlighted all over the place. We should only see highlighted key terms. And as a teacher, what I do is I ask my students to just highlight the command words. So what that means is where it says explain, evaluate, discuss, suggest, they're the words that I get them to highlight, because then that's their indicator of what they need to do next. And I would also get them to highlight, say, in the question, the sort of second part of the question, so what they do have to discuss, but missing out all of the sort of irrelevant content, particularly highlighting or underlining if it says that they need to write and add sketches or something like that. How we want the question to be answered is more important than just highlighting the whole thing. My advice would be to actually ditch the highlighters when you're doing your revision and only use them when completing practice questions and things like that. And instead, use something more like flashcards, quizzing each other, the students quizzing you, in fact, as really good methods to prepare for tests. So flashcards work really well as a form of revision. However, they only work if they're used effectively. So again, a lot of the time our students just overwrite on flashcards, and really what we need is on one side a simple question, and then on the back the answer, and perhaps an illustration which might jog the memory. Okay, just rewriting the notes that you've highlighted copiously onto a flashcard is not going to be effective revision. It's basically just copying out, and the knowledge is not going to sink in. Okay, so mixing it up, if you are going to do a little bit of highlighting, translating that then onto a flashcard is a really effective way to revise, as long as it's then followed up with something else. Flashcards can't be the only method of revision. We really should be trying to mix it up. Now, looking to how we can use flashcards online, Quizlet is a really good online platform for making flashcards, but I advise, I say use this with caution. Oh, Quizlet is amazing. It has everybody else's notes as well, everybody else's flashcards. But what I would say is those flashcards may not all be relevant. You may say type in Romeo and Juliet flashcards. Those Romeo and Juliet flashcards might not be for the exam board or for the particular area that your student or your child is studying. Okay, so it's better to just use it as if your child prefers to use tech, use it to generate rather than steal, I would say, is my advice on that.
Good advice.
Okay, so let's hear what some of our students have to say.
Hi, my name is Annabelle and I am a sixth form student at SWPS here. I have found a really useful tip, which I don't know if many other people do use, but I definitely use it throughout my A-level revision. But it is using a water bottle, just any water bottle that I'm going to be drinking from, and putting it on top of my phone while I revise while it's on the table. So anytime I do go for my phone or do go to try and check messages or something, it reminds me I have to drink water beforehand, and do I really need to go on my phone and check that message?
So I think that was a really good tip there from Annabelle. I mean, it's a simple one, and how she avoids using tech when she's revising. So an example of what we use here at SWPS, and we encourage our students to use here at SWPS to organise themselves and utilise the tech that we have available, is OneNote. Okay, so OneNote is something that each student will have in each of their subject areas. And it's a really excellent way. It's just far more organised than using an exercise book or a ring binder. For one, you only have to remember to bring one thing along with you, which always helps. There's no excuse that you've left the book in your locker or whatever else. You've just always got that iPad on you, and it basically works as an organisation system where you can see, even from the image that we've used on this slide, it can be organised into your different topics, so you can easily clock back and work through those topics and find them nice and easily. And it also means that when we come to mark the work, we can also easily find it. We're not having to leaf through loads of books as well. So it's excellent to use the OneNote as a sort of springboard for any revision. So if you want to then go back, and you can go back and use the highlighter tool with the Apple Pencil. You can then go and convert some of those key terms into a Quizlet or into flashcards. And the other excellent thing that you can do, which makes it more inclusive, is you can change the colour of the background to sort of a pastel colour. You can change it to, I mean, if the student's handwriting is anything as bad as mine, they would definitely need to add the lined paper background. And you can also get a paper-like screen protector on your iPad, which gives you that sort of resistance, much like paper does. So it means that your writing isn't sort of sliding all around the iPad. And you can also use the immersive reader, so you can access that information easier. And a lot of the time, if your child is somebody who struggles to perhaps get down the answers, in a lot of instances we will accept a voice recording instead.
Absolutely.
And likewise, sometimes our teachers actually give verbal feedback through OneNote, and it just comes up as a little voice note. So that works really, really well. I
absolutely agree, Joe. Thank you for that. I think there's some tremendous accessibility tools in OneNote, and it also brings that great deal of consistency to all learners. They all have the same information, and they've got it all beautifully filed. We must have all seen with our own children those sort of disorganized folders. Some of them are beautiful, some of them are not, and OneNote just gives that consistent approach for it all.
So in addition to OneNote, we at SWPS, we also have a VLE, virtual learning platform, called Firefly, which students also use to help organise their homework tasks and their revision tasks. They get set things by their teachers, but they can also set tasks themselves. And it's a place also where we sort of put a lot of resources to sort of help students along the way with their GCSE and exam journey. So this is something that we buy into. Other schools will have other virtual learning environments, such as Frog or Satchel. Or alternatively, if you don't want to use anything digital at all, old school pen and paper, writing down a timetable and planning in that way works just as well. Okay, so how to support my child when they are preparing for exams and tests. So I think the two key factors with this are giving yourself enough time and to allow yourself to be a little bit creative. So providing we aren't leaving preparation until the night before and ending up in sort of cramming territory, students have the time to engage with a revision list, a timetable, and space out their learning, and develop some more creative revision activities to help move knowledge from working memory into our long-term memory. Okay, so recently I asked our Year 8 students which of the two students on this slide had the best exam success, and unanimously, when we put it to a vote, students predicted correctly that student 2, who does only 10 hours of revision but works smart within those 10 hours, making mind maps, flashcards, a real variety of revision resources, as well as then putting that into timed essays, and also feeding in the all-important time to sort of have a bit of time watching TV and spending time with their friends, led to more exam success in the end than student 1, who just crammed for 15 hours, all of which just reading through notes. So despite looking at the two students' work ethics with the Year 8s, most of them actually did say that they actually identify more currently with student 1's approach. So we looked in more detail at how they could perform better and how they could use their time in a more smart way. So by breaking down your revision activities into content-based skills and feedback-related activities, and using a real mix of the three together, and finding out ultimately what mix suits you best or the students best. So if they like producing mind maps and flashcards, great, but then it's all about the next step, which is then practicing some exam questions, creating your own exam questions, doing some self-testing, or even teaching their parents.
Absolutely. I think that balance of content and skills is really, really great. One of the most dispiriting conversations that I have when it comes to a parental meeting and intervention is, you know, the child's underperformed and the parents say, but it's so frustrating because she's worked so hard, she's put so many hours in to her science or whatever it may be, and yet the outcome isn't as good. And I think this is just sings to what you just said, Joe, there, really about working smart. Smart work can be efficient, it can free up that time for the co-curricular things that we've been talking about earlier. And also it does yield better results in the final analysis.
Definitely. And just to further prove that sometimes students don't always know what's best for them, here's some results from a recent psychological survey where they interviewed a collection of students and they asked them for their judgment. So they, first of all, what helped them the most? Was it just reading through notes, as we've said, or doing a little bit of retrieval, which is kind of the mind maps and the past questions, that sort of thing, or being more retrieval heavy? And when the students were asked what they felt helped them the most, they will always say reading through notes. However, unfortunately, as you can see on the other side, it's actually those students who are doing those creative retrieval activities who are achieving the most success when it comes to their final exam performance. So as I said before, it is all about creating a mix. So here's a good list here of the different content, skills, and feedback style activities. And we're not saying that students should do all of them. Not all of them will work for you. It's a little bit of trial and error. And as I said, it's giving yourself enough time to practice these and embed them in. A lot of the time in revision lessons in school, students will be guided as to how to do effective mind maps, effective flashcards and that sort of thing. They'll be provided with past questions to get them started. But it's the real success and the real sort of putting this into action is those feedback ones. They're the ones that are sort of proven that that knowledge is now in your long-term memory because you're able to recall it very, very fluently.
Indeed, and apply it. And what a great, clear summary there, Jo. Thank you very much.
So as I said before, everything is backed up by evidence. So looking at, you know, creating your timetable, whether it is in a notebook, whether it's using OneNote or whatever it is that you've got, it's making sure that we're looking at when the test is, and then looking at when we can space that revision. So rather than doing, oh, on Mondays, I'm only going to revise science, on Tuesdays, I'm only going to revise English, it's about sort of spacing out those topics so it's not too overwhelming. So when your test is 7 days away, every 3 days, we're sort of expecting you would be spending that sort of 20 minutes Pomodoro style revision on those various topic areas to help you prepare. And obviously, the further in advance you're able to plan, the more you're able to get in and move into that long-term memory.
That's brilliant research there, Jo. Thank you very much. And also it just speaks to that point of having a plan, having a strategy for it, working smart all the way. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Jo, and thank you everybody for tuning into this webinar. I hope you found it useful, some good practical tips, some research-based observation, and I hope we've really been able to answer your questions. I think the key take-homes for me is that smart working is effective and that it is possible with those strategies to maintain those sort of co-curricular engagements along the way that give you joy and can end up being what ultimately becomes your career. So often in my career, I'm sure the same for you, Jo, you've seen pupils who've taken a club, something that they've done. We're in a room here at Sir William Perkins School, which is a DVEC room, which is a video editing room. This is a club that we offer at the school, and some pupils will take this on and it will be what they do in later life. So cutting off that co-curricular is such a last resort, a negative thing to do. And I think if you work smart along the way, that can be avoided.
Yeah, so it's definitely, when it comes to working smart, my top tips are planning ahead, giving yourself as much time as possible to prepare that exam timetable and break down that time so that you're spacing out the subjects that you're covering. And also within that, narrowing it down. So rather than trying to revise all of Year 7 biology in a night in one 20-minute slot, just pick one topic within that on each of the given sessions that you give yourself. And whether you decide to utilise technology or whether you're more paper driven, it's about finding the tools that work for you. And that ultimately leads to success, and not sort of leaving it all to the last minute and just highlighting everything.
Having a plan.
Having a plan,
Brilliant.
exactly that. Thank you very much.